Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Cara Gleeson, and I am the Director of Prevention in Action at Our Watch. Before I'd like to start today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional land that I'm joining from, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and note they have never ceded their sovereignty. I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present, as well as acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today and across Australia working in violence prevention and addressing ongoing impacts of colonisation. Welcome to the Change the Story, What's Changed webinar. On the line with us today, there are hundreds of people joining from all over Australia and international, and I thank you all for taking your time to be with us today. Before we begin, I just want to say that, as we know, many of you will have been touched by violence against women in some ways in your lives and other forms of violence. Please take care of yourselves and remember to reach out to 1-800-RESPECT if any issues come up for you. I'll just briefly explain about how today will work. The only people that you will see and who will have cameras on is myself and the panelists and the Auslan interpreters. And this is the only thing that will be recorded as well. There is an Auslan interpreter at the moment, Nick, online, who will be with us for the whole hour, and she'll be working with one of her colleagues. To access closed captions, you can select the function at the bottom of your screen. A recording of today's webinar, including all the accessibility aspects, will be available online after the session, and we'll be sending that to you. In terms of the format for today, I'm going to present about some of the key changes to the second edition of Change the Story, and then we'll move into a panel discussion. We've framed and pitched this event in particular for people who are familiar and comfortable with Change the Story and the evidence base for primary prevention of violence against women. If this is a new space for you, I apologise. We won't be going through introductory content, but I do hope that you stay with us and you find something useful. In the new year, we hope to do more sessions, including sessions pitched directly for people who may be coming to the topic of violence against women and primary prevention for the first time. I also want to say that today we'll be working on the assumption that everyone online is in agreement that violence is not acceptable in any form and that all forms of violence are preventable. We'll ask for questions from the audience, and we hope to have a robust, informed and respectful discussion. Given the large people of online today, we won't use the chat function, but are asking you instead to share your questions through the Q&A function below. I'll be then asking the questions to the panelists, and time permitting, we obviously might not get through all of them, but please do ask a question because it can help us consider information that you may want to find more about. Please note, we have no tolerance for any aggression or discriminatory comments or questions. We are all here for our wants to create a violent-free community and address all forms of inequality and discrimination. Following my presentation on the key changes of the second edition of Change the Story, we're fortunate enough to have a panel of speakers who will talk through aspects of the second edition in more detail. I'd now like to ask them to turn off their cameras and I'll introduce them. You'll hear from Dr. Emma Partridge, Manager of Policy at Our Watch and lead author of both the first and the second edition of Change the Story. You'll hear from Moo Balch, the Director of Prevention at Women and Girls Emergency Centre in New South Wales, and who just last week reminded me that she actually emceed the launch of the first framework back in 2015 in Canberra at Parliament House. We also have Jackson Fairchild, Head of Policy and Programs at Rainbow Health Australia, where he leads on the LGBTIQ Primary Prevention Program and is an author of Pride in Prevention, a guide to the prevention of family violence affecting LGBTIQ communities. All three panellists have lived and breathed and contributed to Change the Story over the last 6 years and probably in the decades prior as well. We're hoping for a robust discussion about what the second edition brings to us working in the field. Lastly, I wanted to say that this webinar is the first of many to come from the Our Watch team in the new year. As such, we'd love to hear your feedback, positive and constructive, so we can keep improving. We're also working on further resources, tools, and whatnot to support you to bring the second edition of Change the Story alive in your work. And we'll have a poll at the end asking you to gather some information about things that you would like and you would find useful in your work. But please also do feel free to send us suggestions as well. So I'm going to start. What is Change the Story? Well, Change the Story is the shared framework for the prevention of violence against women in Australia. It is an interdisciplinary framework informed by a wide range of literature, evidence, research, practice, and theoretical and conceptual contributions from diverse fields. It draws on the contributions of intersectional feminism and anti-oppressive social and political theory and analysis to understand the dynamics of Australian society, including both gender inequality and other systematic forms of social, political and economic oppression, discrimination and inequality. It also draws on the evidence base and principles of public health, particularly the need to investigate the underlying causes, determinants or drivers of a problem in order to determine how to prevent it. And finally, it is founded on international research and evidence from the field of human rights, the human rights-based imperative to end violence, and the human rights principles of collaboration, participation, and ensuring quality of outcomes for all, and informs every aspect of this framework. 5 years after the original, Our Watch has produced an updated, revised, and expanded second edition of Change the Story. At nearly triple the size of the original first edition, it is quite a hefty contribution. The new edition aims to continue to strengthen and to improve Australia's approach to the prevention of violence against women. So what was the process for this second edition? Led by Kim Henderson and Emma Partridge, the process spanned nearly 2 years and included a systematic review of international and Australian evidence produced since 2015, a review of the work that Our Watch had done and published since 2015, including Changing the Picture, the resource to address and prevent violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. From that, there was then a synthesing of the new evidence and an analysis to determine implications for the second edition. Lastly, there was extensive discussions with you, the sector and our stakeholders. And in this, we captured your feedback on the original edition and your suggestions for what could be improved within the second edition. This took place through surveys, workshops, expert reviews of many, many, many drafts, and a technical advisory group. And I want to take this chance to thank all of you who have contributed to this. So what has changed? Similar to the first edition of the framework, it is broken into elements. 7 this time rather than 6, with 2 new elements, the approach to primary prevention and key principles, both of which I think practitioners and people working in prevention across Australia will find immensely useful. Today, in about the next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to try to focus on element 1, the explanatory model, element 3, the actions, element 4, key principles, element 5, techniques and settings, and then lightly touch on infrastructure, mainly because I just can't help myself. I would love to have hours to be able to speak about this in detail. Seriously, the second edition is so in-depth and has so much content in there. First up, the explanatory model. And I do know that this is a small text. I'm going to speak to quite a lot of it, and I hope the image there is just helpful in guiding you. The most significant change is the improved conceptualization and incorporation of intersectionality throughout the explanatory model. In particular, it's in the social context, the top box there. As you recall from the first edition, it was solely gender inequality that was in the top social context, in that we said it's gender inequality that sets the necessary social context for violence against women. In the second edition, there is a recognition that there are other aspects that are also relevant to understanding violence against women in Australia. Gender inequality cannot be disentangled from the other social injustices because gendered inequality frequently intersects with other forms of structural and systematic discrimination, inequality, and injustice. And this includes the ongoing impacts of colonisation, as we found through Changing the Picture. These other forms of oppression have been moved up, if you like, in the conceptual model and are now right at the top within the social context, rather than as a reinforcing factor as they were in the first edition. To me, this recognises not only the maturing of primary prevention practice and evidence in the last 5 years, and the learning and leadership of many who have educated about an intersectional approach to prevention, but also the building of better connections, relationships, and ultimately collaborations with movements and sectors addressing ableism, ageism, racism, cissexism, and heteronormativity. The next change in the conceptual model is the sharpening of the focus on violence against women. There has also been a strengthening of a rationale for our framing of violence against women as opposed to family, sexual, and domestic violence. And I know this will be particularly useful for our colleagues working within state and territory legislative and reform environments that often separate domestic and/or family violence, sexual violence, and sexual harassment. On the eve of the second national plan, it also strengthens the rationale for this framing to be in line with the UN language and the current national plan. There is also a greater emphasis on systematic and structural change as key to prevention, moving beyond the focus on individual and attitudinal change. And you'll see this across all the drivers in the explanatory model. But in particular, I'll draw your attention in a tick to drivers 3 and 4. Apologies, give me a tick. There is also an increased focus on perpetration and on men as perpetrators of violence. A more detailed explanation of the connections between masculinities, gender inequality, and violence against women, and a greater emphasis on the importance of addressing masculinities and engaging men in the prevention of violence against women. Another key development has been further discussion in the use of the limitations of binary language and a greater recognition of the potential connections between this framework and the prevention of violence against LGBTQI people. And this is something we'll go into more detail in the panel discussion. I'd now like to turn to the gender drivers. And as you recall, the gender drivers were and still the dominant factors that most consistently predict violence at a population level. As we know, violence against women is not caused or determined by any single factor, but as the number of relevant drivers and factors intercollude, their degree of influence increases, and so does the probability of violence against women. These factors are termed gender drivers because they arise from gender discriminatory institutional, social, and economic structures, social and cultural norms, and organisational, community, and family and relationship practices that together create environments in which women and men are not considered equal, and violence against women is both more likely to be tolerated and condoned. In the second edition of Change the Story, drivers 1 and 2 remain largely the same. Driver 3 is a little bit different now, and it focuses on the process of stereotyping rather than the stereotypes themselves. While stereotypes are both harmful and limiting, it's the practice of promoting and enforcing gender stereotypes that is harmful, because it falsely promotes rigid distinctions between the skills and attributes and characteristics of women and men. So I've tried to make this a little bit clearer. Driver 3 also solely focuses now on masculinity rather than both femininity and masculinity. That is not to say that rigid femininity isn't harmful, but it's the rigidity of social dominant forms of masculinity that play a direct role in driving men's violence against women. In Driver 4, the concept of cultures of masculinity is included now alongside peer relations. And this is a really strong signal to take it out of the informal space and into the formalized spaces in our society. It takes the focus from groups of individual men to organizations and institutions, effectively moving it up the ecological model from individuals to organizational and institutional. Now moving along to element 2. We've made this element a lot clearer and hopefully easier to use for you out in the field. The actions now align more clearly with the elements of the conceptual model, guided by the colouring: green for drivers, orange for context, and blue for reinforcing factors. On that note, I wanted to share some of the design intention on the second edition. As you will have noticed, we've moved away from the storybook motif, and I think people have been wondering and asking questions about that. Some of the design aims were to visually represent various complex concepts in a concise and clear and compelling way, and to ensure that the material is flexible, can be adapted for different audiences, different formats, and different applications. And we know that many of you will be using this on a daily basis in diverse communication ways as well. We also wanted to convey the weight and importance of this work, but also for it to be understood very easily. And lastly, we wanted it to meet AA accessibility guidelines as well. The inspiration for the concept of the design came from the idea of community advocacy and grassroots campaigns with badges and stickers, and the community workshops and planning that I know many of us have all been in, where we've had post-it notes and ideas sketched out on butcher's paper. There's a subtle but strong nod to the roots of this work in the feminist movement. And I hope that you can all appreciate that. And I'd like to thank Susan Fitzgerald for her work on the design in this area. It's quite beautiful and really versatile to use. All the graphics are available for you to download and to use within your work, and we'll share that link with you after today. Going back to the element, there are now 12 actions, 4 essential actions that address the gendered drivers at the top, 4 essential actions that address the social context, and 4 that address the reinforcing factors. And while this clarity is really welcome, it does bring up quite a pickle for many of us who often have very short opportunities, sometimes only a few minutes, to engage an audience with limited knowledge in this area and get them across what drives violence against women and what is needed for prevention. And I think that brings us back to the intent of this shared framework in Change the Story. No one organisation, community or institution can undertake all these actions, but all stakeholders and everyone can contribute to them. The key actions can be tailored to ensure they address the range of forms of violence that women experience and are relevant for any particular group, setting, age, and to be used in a range of techniques and engaging many people in different areas. Quoting directly from Change the Story, to be effective in driving structural and systematic change, the 12 actions require policy, legislative, regulatory, and institutional support, as well as broad, practical, on-the-ground implementation. And that gives us a good segue to the next element, element 4. This is a new area in the second edition. Some of the content was covered in the first edition, but it didn't have a standalone element and didn't have this much depth. I want to draw your attention to one key principle and that speaks to the increased institutional and structural focus across the whole framework. The first one at the top, using all available policy levers. This is a critical element of prevention practice and can address the drivers of violence against women in many different policy portfolio areas. For example, legislation requiring workplaces to prevent rather than only respond to sexual harassment can reduce this form of violence, just as legislation requiring employers to implement gender equality strategies can help change harmful male-peer relationships in the workplace, as well as increasing women's access to positions of power, thus addressing specific actions 2 and 4. Just moving into element 5, which I'll move through very, very quickly, and I'm not going to go into the techniques in detail, but draw your attention to the settings. We have received some questions on this already. In the first edition, we offered a nice, neat table of 11 settings and 3 dot points on each, and a rationale of what you could do in that area and why. Since then, 5 years later, there has been a plethora of activity taken on by many of you on the call today, and we now have more developed and more succinct evaluation and evidence on some settings, while we've also been completely challenged and our minds opened to understand that there's way more than 11 settings out there. So what we've done is we've included 5 settings in detail, where you'll see greater information on what you could do in that area, why you would do it, and how it connects to structural change as well, which I believe and hope will be very helpful for people working on policy across Australia, on grant design and grant rounds, and prevention program design as well. But then we have also included 10 settings that are listed as priority areas for work to be undertaken to build the evidence and practice expertise about how this could take place. I'm not going to list these now, but I do want to draw your attention to one in particular, and it's disability care services. Just at the moment, we're going through a Royal Commission and we're learning about institutional failings and violence and abuse. There is obviously a need for increased response and prevention work in this area, and connecting the action calling for policy levers to be used and the call in this element 5 for increased investment and priority work in this area. I hope to see that develop over the next couple of years. Lastly, and before I finish up and open to the panel, I just want to draw your attention to element 6, critical infrastructure. This is expanded greatly from the second edition, drawing from and aligning with counting on change and tracking progress in prevention. And it singles out the need for sustained political leadership, a well-resourced and independent women's movement, and mechanisms for workforce and sector development. Unfortunately, don't have time to go into detail here, but I hope that you will have a look at these elements and be able to see where your work is represented and be provided with some guidance and some useful evidence into what you could be doing in the next couple of years. I'm now going to close off on my presentation and invite our panelists to turn on their cameras. While they do that, I just want to reiterate that today I've gone through in very light detail of some of the changes in the second edition. And if there's areas that you would like to know more about, please do let us know, as we'll take that into consideration in designing our content for future webinars. Excellent, I think I have everyone online. Emma, my first question is to you, if that's all right. Can you tell us how the second edition incorporates a stronger intersectional lens, and what led you to take this approach as one of the authors?
Thanks, Cara. Yes, happy to respond to that. I think it's fair to say that strengthening the intersectional analysis and the intersectional lens of Change the Story was one of the key objectives that we had when we set out to produce the second edition. I think we ourselves knew that we didn't do enough in the first edition to achieve that, and we certainly have received that feedback quite consistently from many stakeholders in the 5 years since. So we sort of looked from top to bottom at how we could do that, rather than just, you know, chucking in a little box saying that intersectionality was important. And so we've tried to incorporate an intersectional lens throughout the framework. We have sections that talk about the importance of an intersectional analysis of violence itself. So the way in which we need to understand how a range of different forms of systemic oppression and discrimination produce particular forms and patterns of violence against women, because women are not a homogenous group. And so we've talked quite explicitly about how those intersections can increase the prevalence and severity of violence against some groups of women, They can also limit or undermine the consequences for violence from particular groups of men who enjoy power and privilege, for example. So I think that's one of the key things we've tried to point to, is that intersectionality is not just about looking at oppression and disadvantage, it's also about understanding power and privilege and the way in which men inhabit, different groups of men inhabit that very differently. We've also looked at the way intersectionality or intersecting forms of oppression can influence the way in which gender is constructed and gender inequality is experienced. And of course, we've talked about the way in which it's not just gender inequality intersecting with racism or gender inequality intersecting with ableism. It can actually be about all three of those things intersecting for particular groups of women. So we've really tried to expand the intersectional understanding of violence in itself and what drives violence. The second way we've approached it is to talk a lot more explicitly about the importance of an intersectional approach to prevention. So naming quite clearly that intersectional feminist approach is absolutely critical to preventing violence against all women in Australia, and that needs to be an approach that's integrated both in practice and in policy, in government policy, and at all stages of prevention, from the design to the implementation to the evaluation. We need to be thinking about the ways in which we're addressing those intersecting drivers of violence against women. So we've been quite clear, I think, about noting that, you know, this feminist intersectional approach is not just about acknowledging that people are diverse and that people have diverse experiences. It goes much beyond a kind of diversity and inclusion approach. It's actually feminist intersectional approach to prevention is actually one that explicitly seeks to address those multiple intersecting forms of oppression and discrimination, to challenge them, to change them, to address those systems of power and privilege, because that is creating a context in which men's violence against women occurs. So it's very much a transformational aim. It goes a lot beyond diversity. And I suppose the third way, those are the sort of conceptual bookends that we've used, but the third way is that throughout the framework, we've really tried to use a lot of examples, practical examples of the way in which, for example, Aboriginal women, violence against Aboriginal women is reported in the media in ways that use both sexist and racist stereotypes.
Sorry, Emma, I think we're just... we're just freezing. Yeah, we're just experiencing Australia's broadband issues. So yeah, just the last 5 seconds went a little bit out.
That's okay. Yeah, so we've just sprinkled examples throughout of how the intersecting forms of oppression actually play out for particular groups of women to try and bring that to life a little bit more. I'll stop there and let my internet recover.
Thanks so much, Emma. Jackson, I wonder if I could go to you now. You obviously work with Rainbow Health. Can you tell us a bit about your work there and your involvement in the development of the second edition of Change the Story?
Thanks so much, Cara. It's really lovely to be here today. Well, I've been very lucky to work as part of Rainbow Health Australia's LGBTIQ primary prevention project for the last couple of years. Funded by the Victorian Government, we've been working to develop and build the conversation around LGBTIQ primary prevention. And throughout that time, there's been this building conversation both in Victoria and nationally with a number of key people around where does this work sit in alignment with the work of preventing violence against women. Men's violence against women continues to be a national emergency, an international emergency. And now with growing evidence and research and elevating the voices of community, we also know that LGBTIQ people experience similar rates and in some cases higher rates of intimate partner and family violence. And that conversation has been building, and a key part of that conversation has been Our Watch. I've been involved in some exciting conversations with Moo, who's here today, Emily Maguire, Shane Taz, and many others, as we have sat down and begun to not just ask the question of how do these pieces of work, how can we fit them together, but what are the benefits and the positives of fitting them together? And as Emma just said, that this isn't just about inclusion, it's not just about ticking a box, it's about really looking at where these structural drivers align. And what we now know from our work and from we can see here from Change the Story is how violence against women and violence against LGBTIQ people is driven by, a series of the same and interconnected drivers, being rigid gender norms and gender inequality. And while there are specific considerations for each of those communities and how that plays out can be different, the similarities are there, and a shared problem points to a shared solution. We had a series of really exciting and robust, amazing conversations with Our Watch as we built and refined our understanding of how this work can align together. And that's been translated across into this new edition of Change the Story, which is just so exciting.
Thank you. From all reports, it's been an absolute privilege to work with you and the team there as well through this process. So thank you so much. Moo, I wonder if I can move to you and ask you a question. You've been a leader in the response and prevention sector in Australia for some time. Can you tell us about the significance of having a national framework and where you believe the second edition could take us?
Yeah, it's very exciting. I was reflecting the other day on how far we've come since that launch of the first edition of Change the Story. And while sometimes the change might feel really incremental, and we continue to be horrified day to day by the sorts of things that we're hearing in terms of what's occurring more broadly in Australia, I think that there is, this gives us a lot of hope. I have the real privilege of working both within a grassroots organisation, and so being really quite close to community, but also working with some corporates and businesses in the private sector as well. And so having those two kind of vastly different touch points, it gives me the opportunity to really be able to see from an anecdotal perspective, what sort of change has occurred and how Change the Story is having an impact on the ground, both within really large organisations, where you might have tens of thousands of employees and potentially millions of customers, but also at that grassroots level too. And that's, I think, one of the real beauties of the second edition of Change the Story. Emma and I have been talking for years and years and years, and Jackson as well, around how we can make this a framework that is really practical and that really speaks to those nuances, including violence against women and all the other types of violence that people experience because of that oppression. And I think you've nailed it. It's an impressive document because it gives practical actions. I see this as a real opportunity to take this work to the next level of depth. As far as I know, there's nothing else in the world that looks quite like Change the Story. And certainly conversations I've had with activists and practitioners internationally, they're very impressed by the work that's being done here. So we have, obviously there will always be more work to do, but I think we have a really practical document that allows us to take this work to the next level.
Thanks so much. It's really, really great to hear. Jackson, I wonder if I can go back to you. Can you tell us a bit about Pride in Prevention, work that you've obviously led on and that many of us have been learning from and have drawn from in our practice, and now it's fantastic to be able to sort of see it coming a bit more to life in Change the Story, the second edition as well. Can you tell us about how you see the relationship of the two frameworks?
Absolutely. So Pride in Prevention is our evidence guide that we produced last year. It was one of the first outputs of our project. In stepping into this space, being invited by the Victorian Government to look at what LGBTIQ prevention would look like and to pilot some programs, we really wanted to bring together the available evidence and address some of the key gaps that were there. Unlike the work of preventing violence against women, LGBTIQ family violence hasn't had the same investment in research. And so we've needed to do that work of beginning to propose the conceptual and structural models that we'll use to guide our practice. And it was very important to us in doing so that it aligned with and complemented Change the Story. From the very first time, we began to churn through the research and think about those themes of gender and rigid gender norms. It's not hard to imagine where those alignments are and how you know, these kind of the ways in which society constructs gender, the way in which people are restricted, the way in which gender inequality manifests in our society. We use words, you know, we talk about heteronormativity and cisnormativity, this idea that there's, you know, that there are restrictions and limits on what is considered a natural and normal, and I use those words very strongly in air quotes, you know, relationships, bodies, gender identities and expressions, and how that privileges, you know, the men, how it privileges cisgendered people, and how it privileges heterosexual nuclear family relationships. And in bringing together that work, we realized that this work needs to occur in parallel. These are complementary pieces of work. LGBTIQ communities have been doing the important work of transforming gender norms forever, for literally since the dawn of time. It is our very nature and our provocation to the world. And we also experience resistance and backlash to that work. While we haven't had the same tools in being able to work through this amazing primary prevention approach, the opportunities for collaboration and connection just have lit up. We've had so many people approach us, so many invitations, so many opportunities. And I think many of the practitioners can see the intuitive connections that are there, but now we're starting to really draw that together in terms of the research. And I invite anyone here who hasn't read it to pick it up and take a look. We've got a proposed socio-ecological model of our own that can sit neatly alongside the drivers of violence against women. And we begin to see how targeted particular pieces of work, while they necessarily may need to focus on particular issues such as men's violence against women, and that's okay, or again for LGBTIQ communities, there's a lot of opportunities for work to have a mutual benefit. Challenging homophobia and heteronormativity and cisnormativity will have a powerful benefit for LGBTIQ communities. But what you can see by looking at Change the Story, with the increased focus on things like homophobia and its role in male-peer relations, how homophobia is an important driver of violence against women and an important factor in the experience of masculinity for men and boys, and how they can experience their own gender and begin to feel less policed and restricted by these social norms. And those conversations are building. We're very excited to say that we've been refunded for another 3 years of work, as Minister Williams announced this week, and that conversation will be ongoing.
Thank you. That's congratulations for that further funding as well. That's fantastic to hear. Emma, Jackson's just shared their experiences and expertise with bringing the two frameworks together and how they can sit alongside. And I think that leads to a question that's come from the audience, in that we've obviously tried to really build up the intersectional approach throughout Change the Story, but a question has come through of why maintain the language of violence against women rather than the more inclusive gender-based violence? And I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts.
Sure, yes, and thank you to whoever asked that question. And yes, I would say that I think Jackson has touched on some of the reasons for this in their answer to that previous point. We did have a really good, robust discussion about whether we would use gender-based violence or violence against women or family domestic sexual violence and various other terms. And we've landed on using violence against women for a number of reasons. Partly because Our Watch was established to address violence against women, and it's in our constitution and in our mandate. It's also aligns with the national plan to reduce violence against women, and that's very important for us. It also aligns with the international frameworks, human rights frameworks, that are specifically about preventing violence against women or women and girls generally at the human rights level. But that's not to say that we are uncritical about binary language or that we use those terms like, you know, violence against women or men's violence in an uncritical or unthinking way. In fact, we've included in the new edition of Change the Story a whole section which is titled, I think, The Use and Limitations of Binary Language. And it talks about the way in which, while of course neither sex nor gender or sexual identity or gender identity are binary, or none of those things exist in binary categories. I think we've all long agreed that. Those of us who sit within intersectional feminist approaches, of course. Those categories while they're not binary and they're constructed, they do still have very real binary effects in the world. And so we do still have the situation where cisgender heterosexual women make up the majority of victims of gendered violence across the world. And that's why international human rights frameworks legitimise the use of terms like violence against women and preventing violence against women and girls. And I think we are actually quite defensive about that language. It's really important that it's still okay to talk about women and to talk about violence against women. It's really critical to intersectional feminism, not just other forms of feminism. But what we've also included in the framework is a discussion about the limitations of binary language, the harmful effects that can have when it's used where that's unnecessary. And so where it's possible, of course, we should be trying to use and we should be striving to always use non-binary forms of language, like talking about people of all genders and so on. And when we talk about women, we should be explicitly including both cisgender and transgender women, which we do in this framework. And on top of that, as Jackson has covered in their discussion of the overlap between violence against LGBTQI people, some of whom are women and some are not, and violence against women, we need to be quite nuanced and careful about the way we talk both about the overlaps and the differences in those two agendas. So I would encourage people to read that section in Change the Story, which I think is in the section on framing and language and conceptual framing, because we've worked really hard to really provide a clear rationale for why we use the language that we do.
Thanks so much, Emma. That's yeah, really, really helpful to hear. I wonder if I can now go back to you, Moo, and think about what's been missing from the work in primary prevention of violence against women today, and how do you think we can strengthen this work going forward?
Yeah, look, just picking up on a couple of Emma's words there, I think that that clear rationale has been missing at times. You know, Kara, you acknowledged when you were running through the breadth of this framework that sometimes we only have 5 minutes to explain this, which is terrible, but it's the reality, right? And so I think from a practitioner's point of view, what I've experienced, where there are limitations around time or where this framework sits with work that you're potentially doing, having conversations about response as well, and sort of, you know, really building a community understanding of the issue and the settings and what prevention looks like within various community contexts is, you know, the answers to some of those really simple, annoying and repetitive questions that you get, which I think are being asked less now, to be honest, but it's about things like, well, how does this intersect with race and culture? How does this work in terms of things like poverty, ableism? You know, what about alcohol and drugs? What about the men? What about lesbians? You know, all of these sorts of nuances, which absolutely we've had to, you know, develop evidence-based responses in often in really pressured, you know, situations where there's not much time and you're already up against some of that that backlash or that resentment that we're having a conversation about violence against women. So I see the opportunity here going forward really to not only have a robust framework and an evidence base, but also for us as practitioners, I think, to be able to you know, share some of that back with you. You know, obviously you are the guardians of the document and the framing, but I think there are some real opportunities with this new edition to be able to really talk to some of the practical challenges on the ground, and I hope the way that some of these changes will actually be, you know, will make it a lot easier to answer some of those tricky and, you know, repetitive questions. You know, particularly around that sort of piece around privilege. So where you're talking about, where you're talking to a room of, you know, really privileged women, how do you start to describe these oppressions in a way that actually speaks to their experience, but also makes them think a bit about how they can start to unpack their privilege as well.
Yeah, that's so good. And No, I think we've all been in that room where we're asked the same question that we've heard 150 times, and it actually doesn't matter how articulate we are or what evidence we give. It's about that sort of, what's in the room and who we can connect with and how can we move them along. I think it's a really good point just to say that we've had some questions around, can we develop further messaging guide for how to communicate the key ideas and concepts from Change the Story to the general public? And I just wanted to say that, yes, we can try to do that in the new year, once we've all had a big rest after a very big 2022. I wanted to go to another question that's come from the audience, which, what single change would you prioritise for men to do around transforming dominant forms of masculinities? And I'll put that out to all the panellists for someone to jump in.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to jump in to start. I'm sure Moo and Jackson might also be able to contribute. Another great question, although probably very difficult to answer or find one single thing, because obviously masculinities are deeply, and dominant forms of masculinity are deeply entrenched in our society and culture, and all sorts of things about masculinity need to be changed, not just one thing. So I'm probably going to dodge the one thing part of the question. But I suppose just to note that Our Watch has also produced a very substantial resource called Men in Focus, which reviews all of the evidence on this particular question of how harmful forms of masculinity or what particular ideas about masculinity are linked to and drive violence against women or perpetuate drivers of violence against women, and what needs to be done by both men and women and by organisations and employers and governments to unpack and to challenge those harmful forms of masculinity. So for people who haven't, I very strongly encourage you to have a look at Men in Focus, which is an excellent, leading resource on this piece that also has a very short, succinct summary that's easy to digest. But one of the things we've tried to do in the second edition of Change the Story is bring in some of those key findings and messages from Men in Focus, because it was produced obviously after the first edition. And it is that evidence that has informed some of the tweaks that we've made to the actions about what needs to happen to challenge dominant forms of masculinity. And I guess just a couple of things I'd draw attention to. The first being that when we talk about male-peer relations and the need for harmful male-peer relations to change, we've done a lot to try and lift that up from the idea of, individual men down the pub telling sexist jokes. Obviously, that's part of it, and that's part of what needs to challenge, and men calling out their friends for sexism and disrespect towards women is absolutely critical. But we've tried to lift that up to include, for example, a workplace that has a male-dominated culture or a culture of harmful masculinity that encourages women to be seen as less good as leaders, or men to be put first in line for promotion, or women to be spoken over in presentations and so on. All of that is about cultures of masculinity. All of that is about male peer groups that disrespect and denigrate women. So we've really tried to kind of lift the focus up from the individual level to look at the way cultures of masculinity kind of penetrate all of those aspects of our society, and the need to change at those levels as well. So I guess that's just part of what I draw attention to.
Yeah, I feel like it's lifting it up from the locker room into the boardroom, and just really sort of like lifting it up.
Yeah,
from
exactly. There you go. You should have answered this question.
Yeah, I'm going to open up to Moo or Jackson. Jackson, I see you're off. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd like to just say +1 about Men in Focus. It's a fantastic resource and a great platform for us to continue to build our practice upon this conversation around masculinities and conversation around men and boys. I always go back to this answer. I give it at every Our Watch event I'm at, but I'm going to give it here as well, which is, I just think it's so important for us to think about working with men's homophobia, and to think about the relationship between homophobia and sexism and misogyny. In many of the conversations that I've had with men in this space who are talking about this, when I ask them to consider the role of homophobia in their lives and the role it plays in policing and reinforcing, and both as an expression and tool of violence similar to violence against women that can be used to maintain one's position within the social space, but it's also a internal experience. And I think seeing and meeting and working with men who have worked on their homophobia, we're all born into a homophobic society. It is just part of the background radiation of our lives, and it affects everyone to different degrees. But remembering that this particular issue doesn't just affect gay men, it doesn't just affect queer people. It affects men themselves and their relationships with themselves, their relationships with their own bodies, the way they relate to femininity. And I like to say, when you flip over the coin of homophobia, it's sexism on the other side. And thinking about that conversation, that it is a sort of internal experience of sexism, I think is an important, very important part of this work. In order to, because that's where the backlash and the resistance comes from. And we need to find where the backlash and resistance is in order to be able to do this meaningful work. On the flip side of that, not just to focus on the negative, there's this wonderful term that we talk about in trans and gender diverse work around gender euphoria, about what happens when you are fully in your gender experience and experience joy and a sense of connection and embodiment that comes from that. And while that term is absolutely one that belongs in the trans and gender diverse space and invites us to think, I think, a little bit about how men can embrace and explore these positive expressions of themselves and to find new ways, new freer ways of being with themselves and with women and with gender diverse people in order to be able to live happier and healthier lives where no one experiences violence.
Thank you so much. I love the term, the radiation noise that we're born into. It is describes it so well. Moo, did you want to add anything more to that question?
Oh, I think my learned colleagues have been fairly articulate. I mean, I guess there's a couple of observations I have, and Jackson's, you know, you've kind of said it there. In the same way that we talk about gender equality being good for all genders, so not just gender equality is not just improving things for women. In the same way that we know that sexism doesn't just affect women, that it actually pervades our entire society. So therefore, you know, homophobia and transphobia and discrimination do the same thing. And so I think for me personally, as someone working in this field, if we can find a way to really get that message across to leaders at all levels of society and community, whether they're, you know, leaders of big business or whether they're a leader within a particular community setting, I think that's super powerful. My other observation, and this is just personal and selfish, is if we could do anything to transform masculinities, it would be in that early childhood space. I've got 2 little kids under the age of 5, and I've done a bit of work this year in the early childhood setting. And when you have those conversations with early childhood educators and you talk to them about what gender transformative practice is and looks like and how it will complement what they're doing day to day to challenge stereotypes around sexism and homophobia, and then you talk to parents and you say, actually, this is going to be better for your kids and better for your family because of this and this and this, it just resonates. It makes a lot of sense to people. So
it's so powerful, and probably also is the childhood that many of us wanted to experience and would probably be healthier adults for as well. Yeah, look, there's a lot of questions. I'm not going to be able to go through them in detail, but there's some really interesting questions around just language. Even I'm suggesting that the change the story title can be dismissive of victims' experiences, and to think about, you know, it being change the ending as a potential title for the 3rd edition. Likewise, there's some questions around the terms of men who choose to use violence instead of perpetrator and victim, and women survivor sort of language as well. We're not going to be able to go into huge detail today at all, and I'm going to close off with one last question. I also have had a couple of questions around, is there going to be a video similar to the video that we did for the 1st edition? And yes, we're working on several different products that will hopefully help support you to bring this work to life. So in 2022, we will be in touch with that. We'll share a link with you that can sign you up to a newsletter that we'll be doing quarterly that's specifically for people who are working in primary prevention work, and it will be the best place to find out when that video is done and what what format it's going to be into. But one last question, and it's from the audience, is what is the implications of the second edition of Change the Story for the national plan to reduce violence against women and their children? And we know that the first national plan, a world-leading COAG plan, is coming to its end next year, and a lot of work is being done around what is going to happen next. Emma, I'll pass to you.
Thanks. Yes, that is probably $64,000 question. I think the short answer is we don't know 100% because we haven't yet seen the federal government's draft of the second national plan. Our Watch has been providing advice to the Commonwealth Government over the last 12 months about the development of that plan, informally and formally in submissions and in advisory groups and so on. And obviously all of our advice that we've been providing aligns with the evidence that we've used to inform Change the Story and the approach to prevention that we've outlined in Change the Story. So not surprisingly, we've been advocating for more of a focus on masculinities, for more of a focus on the policy and structural level rather than just the individual level, and for more of a focus on the intersecting, drivers of violence against women and an intersectional approach. So all of the things that we've been able to put together in Change the Story have been part of our advice to the federal government. How much of that advice will be reflected in the second national plan is just something that we don't know at this stage. Hopefully a draft of that plan is imminent, and that hopefully there'll still be room for kind of comment and consultation and feedback on that. But yeah, I guess that's all I can say at the moment. And we also provide a lot of advice to state and territory governments. And of course, the national plan is supposed to be a collaboration between all of the governments in Australia. So they're all at different stages and they're all at different positions in terms of their uptake of Change the Story. But we know that many of the state and territory governments are also, advocating for the prevention approach that we put up. So that's incredibly helpful. So yeah, that's probably my answer. Fingers crossed.
Thanks so much. Moo, did you want to quickly jump into?
Yeah, coming from one of those states where there hasn't been a huge history of funding primary evidence-based primary prevention work, I think that what I can say is I've observed that actually Change the Story edition 1 and now edition 2, I hope will drag those who need a little bit of coercion along the way. Certainly by the sector. The sector will be using this and will be, I think, grabbing it with both hands and delighted to see, the new edition. But sometimes, it is the role of organisations like Our Watch to actually lead in this space. And we know that governments are at different places and spaces in relation to this really important work. And so I think it's such a joy and privilege to be able to work with colleagues from Victoria, for example, because, pride in prevention is something that we could never have done in New South Wales. We don't have the structures and the systems and the history of the work in this space. So let's hope you're dragging the whole country along.
Thanks very much. I just want to say thank you, Jackson, Moo, Emma. Thank you for taking the time for today, but thank you for all the work, leadership, advocacy, and fearless work you've done over such a long time. I think one of the things that I miss the most about being face-to-face is you can't actually give like chockies or a bottle of wine or a flower to panellists who have given their time. So please receive this virtually from us into your hands. And I'll just take the chance to sort of do a bit of a virtual applause to you all for all your work that you've done throughout this hard year for many people. I'm now going to close off and I will move to have some polls very soon that you'll be able to answer a couple of questions on. Moving forward, there's a range of ways that you can engage with the updated framework. You can review the document and the summary, which is up on our website, and links are in the chat as well. And thank you for sharing the links to Pride in Prevention and Men in Focus as well. You can sign up to our quarterly newsletter for professionals promoting gender equality and preventing violence against women. And you can download and use all the graphics from Change the Story as well. We'll send you the link for that. If you want to get in touch, please do get in touch. Our email is workforce.development@ourwatch.org. and all these links and all what I just said will be sent to you after the webinar as well. Now, hopefully, if I press the right button, you'll have a poll that you can just participate in. Please do help us find what is useful for you all. And I want to thank you all for coming today.